One thing we need to understand the fact that we are in the deep crisis. Indian democracy is undergoing the deep crisis. Probably there are a couple of crises that we have been facing it. So in that particular context, is it possible to try to imagine ourselves in 2047? And particularly, how are you going to construct what is called the idea of India? For me, idea of India is important. It's not the idea of India that Nehru derived it from his book Discovery of India. Probably this idea of India is the idea of the minorities. So you need to understand the fact that the minorities do have their own perspective. So the idea of India needs to be looked into, needs to be analyzed, that too critically analyzed. Will it? There are certain questions that we need to ask at this moment. Whether the idea of India that we are contemplating or we are trying to construct, will it lead to what is called a paradoxical situation? That's one thing. The second important thing is that will it lead to what is called the contradictions, severe contradictions, or will it lead to what's called the marginalization of the community? Where will be the community in the new idea of India? That new idea of India is not the urban India, it's not the rural India, or it is not this subaltern India, it's a specific India. Like for example, we have got this model of development, I used to call the Mangalore model of development, which is basically, centered around the Yenapoya University and other things. Similarly, you have got one model here, Shine model of development, which is basically centered around the education system. Can we have the Muslims a separate model? One thing we need to understand the thing is that the South Indian Muslims are far better. If you read the what's called the Satya Committee report, whatever it may be. Let's get into the debate on the crisis that we have been facing it right now. There's if you go by the kind of debate that's been happening, one crisis that we are facing is the democratic crisis. I would say that that's the major crisis, for the simple reason that democracy is under strain. Often, its powers have been, what's that called, the undermined. Even though the sustained effort to undermine the powers of the democracy suppresses or take away the powers of the institutions, particularly the last institution which we believed that it would uphold the democracy, that is judiciary, which is now I feel that it has disappointed us, particularly after the Ganwapi mosque issue. So it's a huge disappointment for us. We have been slowly losing confidence on our democratic institutions. There are two things: democracy as a way of life, democracy as a value, and democracy as institutions. So with the increase, with the influx of the new social media, Twitter, Facebook, and other things. So what happened is that the space for minorities have been shrinking. That's the reason why we have been, in the crossroads. I mean, the crossroads of, our identity, or crossroads of our democracy, where the social media is completely anti-Muslim. That's the reason why narratives, one thing we need to understand the fact that the larger narratives, whether the global narratives, it's about the terrorism or about the clash of civilization that Bush talked about, or the clash of civilization that Huntington talked about, which has been percolated down to us. Clash of civilization is a new concept that the America adopted and the media perpetuated. And media reproduced it, saying that the clash in the world politics is henceforth the clash between the Islamic world on the one side and the Western world on the other. And that percolated down to the Indian context, and saying that now you have the clash taking place between the Muslims and the others. Probably that has generated what is called the Islamophobia in Indian context. This Islamophobia percolated down through the media also. So every houses, every person, every community now feels unsafe in the midst of the Muslims. So Muslims become the other. I call them as the modern untouchables. Given the reproduction of the this knowledge, reproduction of the idea of what's called the about the Muslims or the minorities. This is the reason why whenever the media comes out with the jihad, so that's immediately percolate down to everyday life practices. So now the media is trying to say that there are multiple jihad. So jihad become a common word. Or look at the way when the media try to project, I think the Nizamuddin people, in the Nizamuddin, they have been accused of spreading the COVID. And all the news media, reproduced it, spread the news that Muslims are the biggest spreaders. And that has been percolated down. So the Muslims have become the other in the present context. So that's the reason why the space to engage, to space to counter, that's the reason why one argument that is needed at this moment is that we need to have the alternative narratives. Alternative narratives in the present context. Probably in 1914, 2047 also, we need to develop an alternative model, alternative what's called the narrative, and the alternative idea of Muslims, or the alternative idea of Muslims in India. And arguing that the Muslims are also a part of Indian citizenship, or the Muslims are also part of the Indian culture. Probably the Muslims can overcome some of the crises, quite possibly in 1947. Otherwise, what happens is that they will remain marginalized, given the fact that now there are attempts to suppress the Muslims through the cultural norms, through the physical norms, through the institutions, through the ideas. So, to overcome these things, probably we need to prepare ourselves. And in that particular context, we need to develop a new idea of India. It's not the Nehruvian idea of the modernity or the urban India, skilled India, but it's a minority India. The idea of Muslim India. What constitutes the idea of Muslim India in 1947? Idea of Muslim India is that where the Muslim identities are recognized, either through the recognized through the means of what's called the reservation policy, or through the participation, or through the community rights, or the community engagement, or through the cultural practices. Muslims has to be recognized. That's one thing. The idea of India of the Muslims. That's the recognition. Second is the idea of identity. That the Muslims' identity should be preserved, protected, and should be what's called the celebrated. The idea of India should belong to the idea of identities. And there are two ways of looking at the India, constructing the idea of identities. One is the multiple identities. The second is the uniform, one single identity. Muslims as a single uniform identity, or Muslims as a multiple, diverse Muslims. Diverse Muslims is because we need to engage ourselves with the Indian context. We need to be recognized as a diverse Muslim groups and belong to the India. So idea of Muslims should come from this particular thing. The diverse Muslims, idea of diversity, idea of engaging ourselves through the different means. So the idea of India, of Muslim, needs to engage. That's the reason why I would call it as the 1947 should be the period of dialogue between the cultures, dialogue between the social systems, dialogue between the communities. So if the idea of Muslim India carries the idea of dialogue, probably that would reduce the marginality of the Muslims. Probably that would provide a new space, that would provide Muslims a new authentic voice, and also it provides new identity to the Muslims in 1947. Thank you very much.